In the spring of 1939, the two major Canadian railways were busy with their final preparations for a very special event, the Royal Tour, set to begin in May. As Europe was rapidly heading towards all-out war, the mood in Canada was that of concern, albeit subdued. Throughout the 1930s, the Great Depression resulted in much hardship throughout Canada and around the world. Industries were struggling to survive, and with fewer goods produced, the railways were also in a sad state. If that was not bad enough, the prairie drought of the 1930s added misery to an already dismal situation. Grain traffic, which was always a good moneymaker for the railways, fell off drastically. The worldwide depression also had accelerated the rise of Nazism in Germany under Adolf Hitler. As Germany's power grew, they first flexed their muscle on March 12, 1938, by marching unopposed into Austria. A year later, on March 15th, they rolled into Czechoslovakia, annexing the whole country, while the rest of the world stood by, unwilling to challenge Hitler. Meanwhile, in Canada, there was much excitement and anticipation for the coming Royal Tour. In 1939, the most famous train to cross Canada made its one and only trip. On board were Their Majesties King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, mother of the later Queen Elizabeth II, marking the first visit to Canada of a reigning monarch. The royal train became a legend, and one of the most lasting images of the tour was seeing the King and Queen standing on its observation platform. The tour commenced on May 17th with the arrival of the King and Queen at Quebec City aboard Canadian Pacific's ocean liner, the Empress of Australia. To provide maximum exposure for the royal couple, it had been decided to have them travel by train. Within Canada, travel arrangements were shared mainly by the two major railways, with Canadian Pacific being responsible for the westward journey to Victoria. The 12-car Royal train was comprised of cars from Canadian Pacific and Canadian National, with two Government of Canada cars. The two government cars, which had been refurbished in CN's Point St. Charles shops in Montreal, became home to the royal couple for their 15,200-kilometer trip. The dining car and crew were supplied by CN. To maintain a uniform appearance, all the equipment, including the locomotives, were painted in a special color scheme. All the cars were painted royal blue, and aluminum leaf was laid in diagonal squares between the windows. The roofs were tinted silver, and gold strips ran the length of each car above and below the windows. Safety regulations for the tour were stringent, and all other traffic was held behind spiked switches while the royal train passed. A pilot train carrying officials and the press corps preceded the royal train by an hour, and during that period no railway movements were permitted. Canadian Pacific assigned just one locomotive, Hudson 2850, to haul the royal train over its lines west of Montreal. It steamed over 5,100 kilometers across the country through 25 crew changes without a single engine failure. By this feat, number 2850 earned for itself, and all its sister Hudsons, the right to be called Royal Hudson and to display the royal crown on the running board skirt. In addition to 2850, CP also used two Selkirk locomotives to assist the train up to Kicking Horse Pass in the Rocky Mountains. Selkirk 5919 led the train, and engineer Jack Rutherford and fireman Stanley Lee were joined by the King and Queen for the trip up the east side of the Selkirk Mountains. Throughout the tour, if the engineer noticed a large crowd gathered ahead at a station for which no stop was scheduled, he was instructed to slow the train. Then, using a special buzzer system, he could notify the royal couple of the gathered crowd and give them the opportunity to proceed to the observation platform if they wished. For many Canadians, a brief glimpse of a speeding train was their lasting memory of the royal tour. For the royal tour, 4 automobiles were specially built so that the King and Queen could ride in comfort during the dozens of motorcades across the country. The cars used were a Chrysler Royal convertible sedan, a Lincoln V12 LeBaron convertible, and 2 McLaughlin Buicks. During the tour, while one car was used, the others were shipped ahead to the next cities on the tour. For the westward journey, the royal train followed mainly the Canadian Pacific Railway route, and on the return trip, the Canadian National Railway line. Upon their arrival in Vancouver, the royal couple boarded CP's Princess Marguerite for their trip to Vancouver Island and Victoria. A day later, following their visit to Victoria, the King and Queen returned to the mainland aboard CN's Prince Robert, the flagship of their coastal fleet. At New Westminster, they returned to the Royal Train to begin the eastern trip over mainly Canadian Nationals lines. On the CN route, 4 locomotives took turns hauling the 12-car train. Pacific number 5117 headed the Royal Train from New Westminster to Kamloops. From there, Mountain-type locomotive number 6047 took over the honor of pulling the Royal Train on to central Canada. Northern type number 6400, which had been built in 1936, was CN's newest engine to pull the train. It led the train through central Canada. For the final portion of the tour, number 6028, a mountain-type locomotive, took over the Royal Train from the Quebec Central at Joffre and pulled it through to Halifax. The Canadian Royal Train also took the Monarchs to the United States, where it traveled over the New York Central, Pennsylvania, and Boston and Maine systems. Following their tour of Canada, the royal couple returned to England on June 15th, aboard Canadian Pacific's luxury liner, the Empress of Britain. The excitement generated by the King and Queen's month-long tour of Canada did much to take Canadians' minds off 10 years of depression hardship. But the joy was to be short-lived. In Europe, things were deteriorating rapidly. On September 1st, 1939, Germany's invasion of Poland marked the beginning of 6 years of war. With the outbreak of World War II, the railways became as vital as the armed forces, since they were the only means of transportation with the speed demanded by wartime. They would carry 3/4 of the long-distance freight. The surplus capacity of lines and equipment that had caused many problems and expense for the railways during the Great Depression became a godsend with the demands of war. During the war, one of Canada's major contributions to the war effort was to be the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which would turn out over 131,000 air crews. But before air crews could be trained, bases had to be built, and with that in mind, employees of the CNR's Land and Survey Department were called upon to take on the planning and acquisition of sites for airfields and training facilities, not to mention army camps and munitions factories. Canadian Pacific was also to play a significant part in the plan later in the war through its subsidiary Canadian Pacific Airlines. Designed to handle heavy freight and masses of people, the railways converted to war more readily than most industries, but the long years of the Depression had taken their toll on equipment. At the start of the war in 1939, Canadian National had over 2,500 locomotives, but of these, only about 150 were considered new. So one of CN's first acts to prepare for war was to order 25 new locomotives and over 5,000 pieces of rolling stock. Canadian Pacific also went about rebuilding by ordering 24 locomotives, 1,000 boxcars, 200 refrigerator cars, and 100 automobile cars. Since transporting people and freight was what the railways did best, the conversion to wartime conditions was relatively straightforward, except for the size, type, and urgency of the loads. Also, with gas rationing, the railways were called upon to put on extra trains to transport workers to war plants across the country. As the war progressed, freight tonnage rose as trucks, gasoline, and rubber shortages developed. Along with their normal railway business of transporting goods and people, Canadian National turned out guns and military vehicles at shops across the country. These anti-aircraft guns are in the final stage of inspection before being put on flat cars and shipped out. Canadian Pacific's Angus shop in Montreal turned out tanks as well as Hudson locomotives. All of this extra work was on top of the unbelievable demand put on their repair shops to keep engines and rolling stock in operable condition. This propeller is destined for CN's Prince Rupert Dry Dock and Shipyard in British Columbia. The shipyard, which had been built before World War I, was modernized to construct minesweepers and 10,000-ton freighters. At the Turcotte Roundhouse near Montreal, which was Canadian National's largest roundhouse, teams of boilermakers and fitters worked around the clock to keep the overworked engines in running order. Each day it was normal for up to 245 engines to be serviced and sent back to work. During the Second World War, the railways were able to repeat their achievements of 20 years earlier, coping well with the enormous quantities of war production and the huge numbers of military personnel passing through the ports. As in World War I, Halifax was the principal port, and again it was the old intercolonial line owned by the CNR that coped with the bulk of traffic. As the war in Europe intensified, the railways were confronted with many new challenges. and they all seemed to come at once. They needed to carry more freight per train, better utilize the limited amount of rolling stock, and increase the fuel efficiency of their locomotives. These were all important, but the most pressing problem was getting the trains to Halifax. Hundreds of ships were steaming into Halifax Harbor to take on equipment and supplies, and it took up to 700 boxcars or a dozen or more trains just to fill one ship. There was only a single track between Moncton and Halifax, and as many as 50 trains a day needed to use it. To overcome the bottleneck, a relatively new system called Centralized Traffic Control, or CTC, was installed in the 160 kilometers of track east of Moncton. CTC was installed in 6 months in 1941, and CN greatly increased capacity and safety on that line. The installation of CTC enabled the average speed of freights to increase by 30%. And up to 80 trains per day were operating over the 200-kilometer section between Moncton and Truro. As demand for locomotives and rolling stock increased, old equipment was rebuilt. The railway's research and development departments also worked hard at increasing the serviceability of locomotives, along with all kinds of rolling stock and other equipment. On average, the number of hours a locomotive was available for use was increased by 15%. Every minute of every day, the railways were on the move, transporting passengers and vital war equipment and supplies. In 1942, over 126 million tons of freight were moved by the CNR and the CPR. The passenger loads were also tremendous. Passenger traffic rose dramatically during the war. In 1939, the CPR had carried just over 7 million passengers. But in 1944, that number had risen to over 18 million. One of the many vital services provided by the railways was supplying Alcan's aluminum smelter at Arvida in northern Quebec with bauxite, an essential ingredient to aluminum production. During the war, Alcan supplied over half of all the aluminum produced for Allied aircraft industries. With ship traffic to the St. Lawrence River ports effectively blocked by U-boat action, the bauxite was brought by rail up from the United States. To document the tremendous contribution that railways were making to the war effort, the National Film Board of Canada produced a short film, Trans-Canada Express, in 1944. Scenes of railway activities were filmed in cities and towns across the country, at railway stations, freight yards, repair shops, and industrial plants. The 19-minute documentary, which was shown in theaters throughout the country, was narrated by Lauren Green.
Now, don't forget, fellows, every bomb dropped on an Axis railway yard, an Axis railway bridge, hits the enemy where it hurts him most.
It was the third in a group of large-scale attacks to destroy German railway lines. Great fires were seen in the Bremen yards, where it is believed freight cars were loaded with ammunition and equipment for the Russian front. The Russian news agency TASS reports the capture of
the steel backbone of every program is its railway system. Today in Canada, with over 40,000 miles of track, the railroads weld together her natural and industrial might, link her to the United States. Both nations joined against a common enemy. But in meeting the growing wartime demands, the railroads faced a crisis in manpower and rolling stock.
Hey, Joe! The boss said to ship those 30 Army trucks right away. Not tonight.
431. Clear the tracks. Troop train Jude 431.
You know how much freight we've got to ship. We're short of men. We've got to have more help.
As far as the wheat on track 10. 32 70-ton coal hoppers and track 7.
I know, but my assembly is almost complete and I've got to have that shipment of parts. Before the war's over, too, please.
Keep your shirt on, Bud. We haven't got an empty boxcar from here to the coast. But we'll get it to you somehow.
We'll get it to you somehow, Sir John A. Macdonald said. 'Twas 1880, no railroad yet to British Columbia led. The Rocky Mountains pushed at the sky, a barrier vast and tall, and the folks of BC were far away from Confederation's call. In 82, Van Horn set out to push the railroad through. Against the fury of nature wild, he flung his dauntless crew. At well nigh 3 steep miles a day, they made the steel to flow, as all year round they battered hard through rock and rain and snow. Up Kicking Horse and Rogers Pass, the valiant band thrust on, until at last in 85, their job was truly done. Strathcona drove the Golden Spike at Craigalackie Station. Our distances were linked as one. Canada was a nation.
The railways conquer space to create a nation. This is the beginning. Nothing can keep them back. As the railways grow, so does Canada. Freight trains a mile long, tracks double, locomotives triple in size. Canadian Pacific, Grand Trunk Pacific, Canadian Northern, Intercolonial, Canadian National, names pioneering railroad history. Grain from the West, grain for the world. Salmon from BC to Montreal in 4 days by CP Express. Quebec asbestos and Ontario nickel by CN Fast Freight to Vancouver. Immigrants from England and Russia, from Scotland and Poland and Hungary. A population more than doubled. Cities reaching for the sky. Canada, united by a bond of steel.
Maple Leaf, Saskatchewan. Sure, it's small beside Montreal, but our town ships whole trainloads of the finest wheat in the world to England and even Russia. That gives a town size, that does. You know, it's a funny thing. The railway station seems to be the heart of every town. And no wonder. The railroad brings the world to us and us to the world. Guess it's the 2:14 now. Yep, she's on time. So are the kids. Do you think they'd be late? Just about the same as usual. She's unloading a bit of express, stuff for the drugstore, the mail and newspapers we're all waiting for. There's some airmen off on leave, and a neighbor going to Regina. All aboard! You know, no matter how many trains you watch pull out, you never get over that sad feeling that part of your life's rushing away there into the distance. A train makes a fella dream of what's over the horizon.
Yes, track and train are in our blood. Everybody is a potential Casey Jones. Even if his Cannonball Express is a table model, his Continent only the living room carpet. Railways are fun.
It's early morning. The great engines, motionless and tired, purr and pant softly. You can smell the sharp bite of engine smoke. In the roundhouse, the hostlers are leading out that beauty, the 6403. Her night's sleep is over. The great turntable is waiting to swing the engine around to face a new direction. If we didn't have turntables, it would take miles of track to turn that one around. How easy she moves, and silently. And yet that engine weighs over 300 tons. Some of the engineers on the early runs are signing in. Joe Williams is on the passenger express to Chicago, and Sam Jones drives away freight. Stops at just about every station, dropping one boxcar and picking up two. Freight, you know, is the main business of the railway companies. They say if you want a big job, go wash an elephant. Well, the maintenance crews know all about that as they go over every inch of the big locos, getting them ready for the day's run. She's checked and oiled and her belly full of coal and water, her fires bright and new. Sweet and shining, she goes to meet her road crew. At the yard office, the train crew get their orders for the run, while others check in after their jobs are through. They make sure they have the official time. In the railways, you can't be more than 20 seconds out. Upstairs in the bunkhouse, the crew that's laying over are taking it easy. The Railway Brotherhood is one of the oldest unions in America, with a reputation to be envied. A lot of the old-timers are back with us now, and we're proud of the fact that over 30,000 railway workers have joined up. We've got women filling in some of the new jobs now, too, and they sure brighten up the place. Where life and limb are risked, these railway workers go hopping off and on running trains like the average citizen climbs onto a streetcar. Behind that devil-may-care way is experience learned the hard way. On their skill and integrity rests the safety of all the lives and valuable property entrusted to the country's railroads.
Like the sadness felt when hard times catch up with an old friend, Canadians saw the railroad struggle through the bleak 30s. Of the little cargo they carried, some was human freight, the unemployed looking for work. While next to the railway lines, the air was thick with the exhaust of transport trucks, and a whole generation grew up knowing as their only means of transportation the automobile. And it was the automobile that took a continent's tourists to see Canada's natural wonders. Organizations of the Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Railway systems gear themselves for all-out war. Allocation of rolling stock, shortening of routes, parlor cars to be converted to day coaches to handle 26 million more wartime passengers. With scarcity of materials and skilled men, rolling stock and engines now doing double duty must be overhauled and reconditioned. Engines pulling heavier loads wear out wheels and gears faster. But despite this wartime pressure in every department, the railway shops have the skill and machines to build heavy steel equipment, give over their resources to the building of tanks made famous on the Russian front, and guns proving themselves on land and sea. Other Canadian railway shops are turning out one locomotive each day for a sister ally. Canadian-built railway engines are pulling troop trains to the jungle front in India. New wartime problems, new solutions.
Sure, that's the spot to put up the plant, and there's swell plans, but you've forgotten one thing. How are we going to get the tugs to the water?
Why, man, that's simple. We'll ship them by rail.
And so the plant goes up. The keels are laid. The tug is on its way to sea. Every viaduct and passageway has been measured. Is there enough clearance? She makes it. And so a locomotive helps a ship to the sea. As Canada's war effort leaps ahead, 150,000 railway workers, manning the country's largest wartime industry, open the throttle for the railway's longest and greatest haul in history. From forest, prairie, and factory, mountainous piles of Canada's products, sugar beet, trucks on wheels, trucks and threads, Vickers and Wolfer's guns, timber, raw and finished, engine parts, sides of beef, backs of bacon, industrial alcohol, dynamite, all moving forward on the tanker, flat cars, refrigerator, and box cars of her railways. In this ability to marshal their strength for war, Canadians see the foundations of their country's tomorrow in a world at peace. Summer and winter, battling against the worst railroading conditions of any country, Canada's proud railroads are getting the goods and men through, feeding the lines across the sea.
And we will make the special train from Winnipeg through the coast. Well, this does it. The question now hangs on whether or not we can get sufficient equipment from the railways to get these men down to the port in sufficient time to make the convoy. Captain Black, will you contact the railways and get action on it? Yes, sir.
But the best we can do is couple of the 3 coaches of men onto the Trans-Canada Express at Montreal. Give it a gold-plated priority through to the seaboard. Okay. Now we'll have the men picked up at their camp.
It's up to the railroads now to get Company B through to the convoy.
Attention, everybody. The Trans-Canada Express will be 45 minutes late.
The railway station receives them all these waiting ones. They go to new jobs to get war contracts. They're going home. Against this living fresco is enacted daily the drama of a nation at war. The repatriates from the battlefronts. the homecoming sons and husbands. Down below on track 9, the men of Company B join the Trans-Canada Express.
Attention everybody. Trans-Canada Express now leaving on track number 9.
Last-minute mail bags are rushed on. The waiting train is ready with its waiting load.
All aboard.
There are 3 Trans-Canada trains that make the run from Montreal to the seaboard. Passengers come all the way from Vancouver. They pass through mountain ranges, cross flat prairie, wind down around Ontario lakes, hit 70 miles per hour to Montreal. Except for the attaching of Company B to this train, it is just like any other run.
Club car? No, sir.
Day or night, sun or cloud, the railway's job is never done.
Where the deer and the antelope
Railway job, express job, railway job, never done. Day, night, cloud, sun, express job, never done. Railway job, never done. Day, night, cloud, sun, never done. Cloud, sun, cloud, sun.
The convoy, the sea, the run is over. Soon the men will be on board ship, but the railroad's job goes on. More goods to haul, more men to transport. Taking Canada to the world.
In addition to the business of running railways, both the CNR and CPR had major interests in steamship lines. These fleets of passenger and cargo vessels traveled the world's oceans and the lakes of Canada. Canadian Pacific had always cooperated with the Royal Navy and the Royal Canadian Navy in encouraging seagoing staff to undertake the special training required to qualify as officers in the Royal Naval Reserve. Some of the duties undertaken by CP Royal Naval Reserve officers included the command of convoys, destroyers, frigates, corvettes, and minesweepers. During World War II, 18 Canadian Pacific Ocean liners, plus 2 Canadian Australasian Line ships and 2 vessels from the British Columbia Coastal Service served with the Merchant Marine. Of these 22 ships, only 5 returned to CP service after the war. Following the outbreak of war in 1939, the Empress of Japan was among the first ships to be requisitioned for military service and painted gray. Then, in October 1942, prompted by Japan's entry into the war, the Empress of Japan was renamed the Empress of Scotland. During her war service, she steamed over 500,000 miles, made 3 round-the-world trips, and carried over 200,000 personnel. The Empress of France, built in 1928, entered military service in 1939. and transported troops through till 1947, when she was returned to Canadian Pacific and continued in service until 1960. The Empress of Britain was the pride of Canadian Pacific's ocean fleet. Launched in 1931, she was the epitome of luxurious ocean travel on the Atlantic Run and on its annual round-the-world cruise. With the start of the war, the Empress of Britain was quickly painted gray and pressed into service, transporting troops. But in 1940, the Empress of Britain became the largest Allied merchant ship to be lost in World War II. She was returning to her home port on October 26th, when she was attacked and set on fire by German bombers, when only 70 miles northwest of Ireland. All but 49 of the 600 people on board were saved. The blistered and burnt hulk was taken under tow, but 2 days later, the German submarine U-32 sighted the liner and fired 2 torpedoes, sinking her. During the war, the government took over 22 of Canadian Pacific's ships, and of those, 12 were sunk in action. Canadian National also had a sizable fleet of ships, and early in the war, CN passenger liners Prince Robert, Prince David, and Prince Henry were converted to armed merchant cruisers. Because of CN's foresight, all 3 ships had been built so they could be easily converted to warships in the event of war. At sea, the CN vessels Prince David and Prince Henry served as armed cruisers up to the invasion of Europe. At that point, they were converted to motherships for landing craft and did service on D-Day and in the Mediterranean. Prince Robert became an anti-aircraft cruiser for convoy duty, and all 3 survived the war, but none returned to CN service. The CN's lady ships were not so lucky. Of the 5 vessels, only the Lady Rodney, which had become a troop ship, escaped unharmed. Ladies Summers, Hawkins, and Drake were all sunk by German U-boats. In late 1944, Lady Nelson was also torpedoed, but she was repaired and converted to a hospital ship and used extensively in bringing the sick and wounded servicemen home to Canada. Although steam-powered modes of transportation in the form of railways and ships were CP's main business interests in the 1930s, that interest also turned to the air in 1941. Initially, CP purchased 10 Bush Airlines in northern Canada, and on January 1st, 1942, Canadian Pacific Airlines was born. During the war, CP Airlines made an effective contribution to the war effort by training navigators at a number of air observer schools they operated for the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. They also overhauled aircraft for the RCAF. Along with these activities, Canadian Pacific Airlines helped to establish and operate the Northwest Staging Route through Canada, which was used in the ferrying of aircraft to Alaska and Russia. In December 1941, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and subsequent thrusts into Malaysia, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies threw Canada and the United States into frantic activities to bolster West Coast defenses. Then early in June of 1942, the Japanese seized Kishka and Attu in the western tip of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. With Japanese soldiers on North American soil, the urgency to get military personnel and equipment to Alaska greatly increased. To strengthen defenses, Royal Canadian Air Force squadrons were stationed on Annette Island in the southern Panhandle to defend Prince Rupert on the British Columbia coast. Prince Rupert, with its shipbuilding yard, was of military importance, and it was a vital port for local defenses and supplying inland projects. At the same time, the American Army was building the 2,700-kilometer Alaska Highway between Dawson Creek, British Columbia, and Fairbanks, Alaska. When the Japanese invaded the Aleutians, CN's Pioneer diesel engine number 9000, which had been built in 1928, was pressed into war service. The engine was covered with armor plate and assigned to a 7-car armored train to protect the right-of-way on the line to Prince Rupert. This special train consisted of 2 armored boxcars and 4 flat cars with armor-plated side walls. The boxcars were covered with armor plate and had 8 shooting ports on each side of the car. On 2 of the flat cars, a cannon and searchlight were mounted. The other 2 cars each had 2 anti-aircraft guns, one mounted at each end of the car. Luckily, the train was never needed to repel a Japanese attack on the Prince Rupert line. By the end of 1942, Japan had stretched the railway's war efforts to the limit. Prince Rupert on the British Columbia coast became a busy port when daily trains went from 6 to 16, with the U.S. Army using the port to transport troops and freight to Alaska. CN also undertook a task of building a 3,200-kilometer military communication network throughout the wilderness of British Columbia's Pacific coastal area. In addition, the Northern Alberta Railway between Peace River and Edmonton became a 500-mile supply route for the building of the Alaska Highway. As the war greatly increased railway revenues, it also strained the railway's equipment and people to the very limit. Every engine and piece of rolling stock was put to use. In 1939, the CPR had about 49,000 employees. But by 1945, this had risen to over 70,000, even with the enlistment of almost 21,000 in the Canadian forces. Although railroaders could claim exemption from active service, this did not stop thousands from joining the Army, Navy, and Air Force. By 1943, the CNR had 14,000 in Canada's armed forces. Close to 1,000 of these were in the Army's Railway Operating Group, which was helping to run bomb-battered English railways. After the D-Day landing in France, they were put to work repairing rolling stock, switches, and railway communications as the Allies pushed toward Germany. After spending years destroying railways throughout Europe, the Allies now needed those same railway lines to transport their own troops and supplies. By 1944, CN's war effort had reached its peak, with 102,000 employed in railway and telegraph services. The war also brought on a change in the number and types of jobs that women were hired for. But it was only because of a shortage of men that the railways hired women to fill jobs traditionally occupied by men. In addition to jobs that already had women employees, hundreds were hired as welders, crane operators, oilers, and laborers. But none were employed in the running trade, the people who actually operate the trains. It would take many more years before equal opportunities for women in the railways would be realized. While women had been 17% of Canada's labor force before the war, only 3% had been in the railway service as stenographers, clerks, and telegraph operators. Most of the women in blue-collar work gave up their jobs after the war to returning veterans. With the end of the war, the biggest task remaining was to bring the troops home. In 1945, CN transported 208,000 men and women on 600 special trains, in addition to sections added to regular service. One ship alone, the Queen Elizabeth, required 16 trains to transport returning troops when it docked. CN's hospital ship, Lady Nelson, made 25 crossings of the Atlantic, bringing home over 13,000 sick and wounded personnel. After arriving in Halifax, they were transported home in special hospital trains. These trains included hospital cars, which had been built for taking care of wounded and convalescent soldiers, returning to Canada for transfer to hospitals in various parts of the country. The cars, which had been rebuilt from sleeping cars, were equipped with 8 hospital cots, 8 upper berths, a doctor's office, nurse's room, kitchenette, and dispensary. By the end of the war, the railways were carrying twice as much freight and 4 times as many passengers as they had in peacetime, even while 1 in 4 of the pre-war workforce had enlisted in the armed forces. The importance of Canada's railways during World War II cannot be overemphasized. The railways took on the challenge via rail throughout the country, in ships on the oceans, and even in the air with the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. With their ranks growing to close to 200,000, railway workers made a major contribution to the war effort. They transported vital raw materials needed by war factories, then carried the finished war materials to the coast and overseas. They even built ships, tanks, and other weapons. Throughout the war, the railways were the only quick and effective means of carrying the millions of passengers and the hundreds of millions of tons of war supplies vital to winning the war. Canadian steam at war is unquestionably one of the railway's finest hours.